What's up, y'all? It's Shuffle. We're going to take a break from match commentary for Butcher Circus to going to some kind of dialogue discussion type deal for Butcher Circus. We're going to be talking about stress teams today. Everyone has probably played against one at this point if you've played more than 5 games, and most of us have played one just to dabble in it, and then everyone has opinions, and it seems to me, from what I've read and from the people I've talked to, that the perception of stress is mostly negative. I understand why. We'll talk about the pros and cons, we'll talk about why people don't like stress, and then we'll do some analytical discussion because that's just kind of the theme of this channel, and then also we'll talk about some solutions to stress if Red Hook's listening, which hopefully they are. I don't know. They're probably not. We're too small of a YouTube channel, but you know what? It's okay. I'm actually going to defend the existence of stress in Butcher Circus, and I'm going to sum it up with like a thesis statement here. So if you're doing a college paper, this is what I would submit. Stress needs to be in the game, and it needs to be viable because it is core to the design philosophy and mechanics of Darkest Dungeon. Period, I guess. The reason I say this is because I remember watching the Escapist documentary for Darkest Dungeon. If you haven't watched it yet and you like Darkest Dungeon, go do yourself a favor. It's a nice hour and a couple minutes worth of viewing. Maybe you can watch it as you eat dinner or just wake up and chill and watch it or something, but it's worth a watch. One of the lines that stuck out to me in that documentary was that being an adventurer sucks. That was part of the design philosophy of the game, and that's how they arrived at the stress mechanic. It wasn't just the fact that it is like a Cthulhu mythos and stress and insanity are a huge thing in that type of setting, but they wanted to really emphasize that going into ruins, fighting monsters, and, you know, even though you come back with gold and gems and heirlooms and you're doing your job and stuff, or glory if you're into that kind of thing, it's still just not enjoyable. There's no fun in something like that unless you're a little bit insane. This idea is the biggest reason why I think stress needs to be viable. I think some people are forgetting the base game of Darkest Dungeon at this point, where stress is just a big thing, but we played so much vanilla Darkest Dungeon that we know what our comps look like, we know what the enemies are. You know, if it's not our first playthrough, we know what to bring, we know how to deal with stress, we know how to minimize it, we know how to heal it. So we're very used to it. We know what happens, and when it goes over the edge and we get afflicted and stuff, or have heart attacks, depending on your light levels and such, it does represent a lot of challenge. But in Circus, I think people are looking for something different. They're looking for more of a competitive PvP game with Darkest Dungeon, instead of just seeing this as an extension of Darkest Dungeon, which I'm not saying that you need to like the stress mechanic or that you have to think it's fun or you have to agree with me, but like I said, this is kind of my defense here as to why it needs to exist. And that biggest point is that it is just in the game design. It's a big part of the vanilla game, it's a big part of the design philosophy, it's a big part of the universe, and stress is just there. Like, there's no Darkest Dungeon without Chatwood doing the music, there's no Darkest Dungeon without Wayne June as the narrator, there's no Darkest Dungeon without stress, there's no Darkest Dungeon without Barassa's art. Like, those things are very defining. That's before we even get into the actual mechanics of the game, like the, you know, the turn orders and the moves and the resistance and stuff, which is all fun, that's why we all still play, but stress is like at the heart of Darkest Dungeon. So that is why it needs to be present, and it needs to be viable, because if it's not viable, if it's not represented, then it feels like Darkest Dungeon, even in Butcher Circus, just isn't quite Darkest Dungeon. With these ideas in mind, let's look at the pros and cons of stress teams, so we can get a better understanding of why people use them. I didn't want to bury my ideas and thesis and stuff like that in the back of the video. I feel like that's better to just get out up front. But the pros of stress are that stress teams are very easy to use. Most characters only have like 1, maybe 2 stress moves. Some have more, but you know, that's like Plague Doctor, and who uses Plague Doctor? But otherwise, it's an easy game plan. You just put on the stress boosting trinkets, maybe some defense or some accuracy or dodge or whatever you're doing, and then you just press the stress buttons every turn. Doesn't matter what my character is, if they have a stress button, I'm pressing the stress button. I'm pressing Zealous Accusations, I'm pressing everyone's favorite Bellow, I'm pressing Yop, I'm pressing Festering Vapors or Hound's Harry. There's just so many stress moves, and when you face a stress team, that's all it is. It doesn't matter what the secondary effects are too much. Sometimes the bleed and blight from the big cleaves and stuff are kind of relevant, but for the most part, You're just trying to fill up the little white bar under the health bar and just hit all the stress buttons every single turn. The next point being stress is effective. You don't have to do 45 hit points and worry about prot. You don't have to do 29 hit points of damage and stuff. You just have to do 100 stress, and then you have to do 100 more stress. And then sometimes, depending on if they heal out of heart attack range and stuff, you have to do a little bit more. But usually by the time people are chain heart attacking, if you're not about to lose, the stress team is about to win. So it's a very effective game plan. It goes against all teams. It doesn't matter really what team you're running. You might have some defenses set up, or you might have to like throw in a stun or a guard depending on what's happening. But for the most part, if they are a mark team, if they're a direct damage team, if they're like a bleed cleave or something, you're just doing stress buttons every single turn. So it's a very singular game plan. You use the same game plan to beat everyone. And that can be frustrating to play against because it doesn't matter what team you roll into the circus with. You can roll in there with some meta comp or some off-the-wall stuff, and if you face a stress team, it's doing the same thing. Crusader's going to be hitting Accusation every turn. Man-at-Arms is going to be hitting Bellow every turn. Plague Doctor's going to get pulled and die every fight. And then Occultist is going to hit like Weakening Curse and maybe Spaghetti Blast. But otherwise, you don't see too much change in terms of the gameplay. The third point, I think, is actually a pretty big one in terms of why it's effective. So in Darkest Dungeon, the other part of the design philosophy is the RNG. The same thing from the Escapist interview. I think Chris Brass is the one who said that. He likes the idea that you can just lose a coin flip and it's over. Most of us hate that because, especially in our competitive environments, you don't want variance. You want to lose by your own skill. You don't want to lose because you played someone and they got like the 1 in 125 against you or something. You just lose because of it. You want to lose because of your own mistakes, not because of variance. And that's what stress is. Stress is a low variance type of tactic. What happens when you're afflicted, like what afflictions you get or what you do when you are afflicted, you know, maybe you pass your turn, maybe you move out of position, maybe you just get attacked normally. That's all variance, but for the most part, stress itself ignores variance. If it can make contact, so if your dodge isn't too high where you just miss the stress attack, then stress is always inching towards the same game plan at like set increments. So if you don't have any stress boosting trinkets, Bellow's always hitting you for 12, Accusation's hitting you for like 27 with some stress trinkets, or Yop hitting you for like 25, 30, what have you, Weakening Curse for 36 sometimes. And it's always marching towards that game plan with like no change in the amount of stress, you know, because when you swing a sword like Leper Sword, it'll be 15 to 24 damage, for instance, and there's some variance there. You hit 15 twice, that's way worse than hitting 24 twice, or hitting 15 in the average, you know. But with stress, you just do the same amount of damage. There's no variance in the stress damage. The only thing you can do against it is either dodge it or lower it by a set amount, but it's always going to come at the same number every time it makes contact with you. And that makes it so the stress team has a lot of control in what attacks they get to use. They don't have to go, well, if I hit this crit with, you know, my Grave Robber that's 37% chance to crit or whatever, then I think I can go for this instead. You don't have to gamble with stress. It's, if I make contact, I'm doing 12 stress, for instance. They only need 10 more to afflict. I do that, and then I hit them afterwards with Weakening Curse for 36 stress and stuff like that. So it's a very low variance game plan, which takes out the other big difficulty factor of Darkest Dungeon, which is the randomness. The fourth point, in the same idea of lowering variance, it also ignores Death Blow. All you have to do is heart attack someone, and as long as they have 0 hit points and they hit heart attack status, so 200 stress, they're dead. There's no resist, there's literally nothing they can do about it. Sometimes you can have some damage over time effects like a bleed to keep their hit points down. So if you have more bleed than they have restoration, you're always guaranteed a heart attack. And a lot of the stronger stress moves do like minimum 25. So like Zealous Accusations, I think with a boost can do 25. Yop and like Weakening Curse, Panic Darts, those kinds of things. Which means that if the stress team is able to order their turns properly and they're not like disrupted too much or stunned, if you hit a heart attack, even if you don't die to the first one and you lose the 25 stress from heart attacking, so the game just doesn't, you know, insta-kill you, you can still just get hit again like right after that. If you can't heal, you're just dead. So you get heart attacked by hitting 200 stress, you heal down to 175, you can't heal yourself, you know, maybe your healer's already dead or they took their turn, and then here comes a cultist and he just shows you his skull and you go, oh my god, and you just drop dead. I think this is also exacerbated by the idea that right now in Circus there isn't like a death animation for heart attack unless it's the last hero. You just like kind of flicker away, like you get Thanos snapped and there's just a corpse. So it's not even like that satisfying death blow and you get to watch them fade out of existence kind of animation that the direct damage has. And since it ignores this variance of death blow, that is another reason it's so effective. And when we talk about something like the Bounty Hunter at some point, I'm sure I'll do a video on something related to him. That's the other reason the Bounty Hunter is so strong right now, right? Is finish him plus some trinket like a finisher or the Heartseeker or something like that. He can pretty much guarantee that you die if you're at 0 hit points, and he can do at least 1 damage. So as you'll notice, most of the strongest teams in Darkest Dungeon, not just the Circus, but like the base game as well, are the ones that limit variance as much as possible, which means that stress, since it lowers variance to one of the smallest degrees of a game plan, is one of the reasons it's as highly effective as it is. My final point I had listed as tank busting, but it's really just the fact that stress can dismantle all strategies. So for tank busting, it doesn't matter if you have 70 hit points or 90 prot or 90 blight resist or something like that. If you heart attack, you just go to 0. And once you heart attack once, it is very difficult to keep yourself out of dying range. Like, you need certain healers, and your turn orders have to come in a good way, or you have to use them effectively and hope you don't get stunned. I just hit my keyboard by accident. When that's happening, it's very hard to keep someone not dead, especially if they have some of the stronger stress moves that do at least 25 stress damage. So it's pretty much once you have a heart attack, that's basically a death sentence. Even if it doesn't insta-kill you, it's just going to keep stressing you out, killing them, and then you have to keep dumping resources in that person to keep them alive, and you're just going to lose out eventually unless you're already close to clinching the game. The other half of that point is that stress just disrupts all other strategies. You know, the afflictions can happen even at 100 stress, like the moment you get afflicted, sometimes you pass a turn or move out of position or something like that, and once that starts happening, you just start falling apart. You know, skipping a turn is devastating in Darkest Dungeon, and then being behind with something like stress already, where your stats get lower depending on the affliction you have, or your ability to attack other teammates, which helps your enemy by quite a lot. Once you start skipping turns and stuff, it's very hard to recover. You know, skipping a turn normally, if you time out by accident, for instance, is often difficult to recover from. Like, I've had a couple games where I just wasn't paying attention to the clock and I missed my turn. I just lost for it. And stress can just do that to anyone at any time, which is part of the reasons it's effective, but also why people don't have fun playing against it. Moving on to the cons, that is actually our first point. It is not fun to play against. No one wants to think, man, I'm going into this arena where I'm going to fight other heroes that came in on the stagecoach for some kind of crazy blood sport. And then what happens? I die to an old army commander that's just yelling at me for, you know, stressful decibels. We talked about the afflictions in the other segment, but that's the other point, or the second point I should say, for the cons. It's frustrating to play with afflictions, because sometimes you just get the worst luck. You know, you pass like 3 turns in a row, or someone just moves out of position, and it's just not fun. But there are other times too, like I've had this on video even, where I played someone recently that was going to get themselves killed versus my stress team. They had a Hellion in rank 3, but she didn't want to break through because I had a riposte up. So the player just tried to move them. They tried to use, you know, button 5, move up 1 space to get into rank 2. And the occultist actually stopped him because he was afflicted, because I was running a stress team. That was actually a detriment to me in that case, because if that person moved up there, I was going to hit Zealous Accusations and I was going to heart attack the Hellion right there. This randomness of the afflictions usually goes against the afflicted, but very rare cases it can actually help the afflicted. Sometimes you have like an Arbalest with the, I think, Fearful Affliction or something, where she wants to move back all the time, so she'll move back in a position before you get to shoot. Those kinds of things, and sometimes you just lose on that. You know, it's one of those coin flip losses that just isn't satisfying. The third point for cons is the fact that the stress teams almost always fight you the same way, and it doesn't matter what you use. If you're using a bleed cleave or a mark team or another stress team or something with some stuns and movement and a little more control, or some hyper direct damage aggro team, something like that, stress is always going to do the same stuff to you. They may guard when they need to with Man-at-Arms, or they may bolster sometimes, but it's usually just going to be hitting every single stress button every single time, doing the same exact numbers to the same people, to the same ranks, and you're going to get afflicted on pretty much the same turns, and then you start, flipping coins and rolling dice. For people that don't like standard just meta stuff where like 2 or 3 teams dominate, or 2-4 characters depending on, what game you're playing, this can just be not fun in general because the stress game plan is always the exact same. They rarely have to pick specific targets. They always just dump the same abilities to the same people and then win the same way. Which for the stress team, that's exactly what you want. You want a very solid strategy that always wins when it can do the exact thing it wants to do. But playing against it just leads to, I think we've used this word a few times now, just very unsatisfying losses or wins. Even when you win, you're just like, well, you hit Bellow 8 times, and I was able to kill you before you heart attacked my 3rd character, so GG. The final point in the cons section has to do with virtues and stress healing. Stress healing isn't mega strong in this. Like, in most cases, you just stress heal to try and set it back, maybe 1 turn or something, or if you're using Inspiring Cry for some reason, you're trying to get the virtue chance. But otherwise, stress healing is kind of for how efficient the stress attacks are, especially when you consider things like Houndmaster and Musketeer, who have group stress heals, but they have like 85% chance or whatever, at least the Musketeer does, to go off, and that's just bad, where Bellow can get up to like 112 accuracy or 116 if you have like the stress mask and the insignia of rank and stuff like that. But then meanwhile, I have to roll the dice for 15 for my Musketeer to barely heal 1-to-1 against Bellow and not even cleanse debuffs because it's not the Arbalest Flare. But this isn't too surprising considering that Darkest Dungeon is a game at its core that does reward offense over defense. If you've ever noticed something like the crit buffs that people get when they, score critical hits, they get little bonuses, which means that the game always wants you to be offensive. This is why most of the recovery moves, in a lot of cases, unless you have like super stacked healing trinkets or something like that, are usually not as effective at stress healing. Just as an example, Abomination transforms and he puts horror on everyone, which gives you 8 stress per turn for 3 turns, so it's 24 to each person, and that's just for transforming, and then he can do whatever else he wants. And then you look at something by comparison, the Jester, who would have to individually stress heal each person to remove that. So in terms of action economy, stress moves usually come out much farther ahead than stress healing, so that's why it's not that effective, which is why stress can run as dominant as it can right now. And then the virtue chances are just not good. I think it's been unofficially confirmed, I haven't been on Reddit for a minute, but the base virtue chance seems to be 0. So that means that the only way to get virtues is to use trinkets or something like Inspiring Cry, which gives you virtue chance. And then at that point, you're really just hoping for a 20 or like a 15 or 30% or something like that in order to go virtuous, which only sets the stress strategy back. It sets it back quite a bit, but it doesn't you don't go, virtuous and all of a sudden the stress team just instantly disconnects or something. You don't just instantly win the game. That's just one person isn't getting as boned by it as the rest of them for a couple extra turns. So this means that even though there's stress healing and virtue chance and all that, most of the time the stress team is still favored in every applicable scenario where you'd want to stress heal or the virtue chance dice get rolled. So we're going to go into the analytics section here, which some of it does have overlap over the other stuff we've been talking about just because they're core concepts. But stress isn't as lethal at first as other teams are, like damage over time or just direct damage or mark or something like that. They have this really slow build-up effect, so 1 or 2 turns, you get 1 or 2 afflictions, something like that. Then by turn 4, usually everyone's afflicted. And then you're starting to look for heart attacks. So you're not really seeing a lot of people just dropping dead until, halfway through the game. Whereas something like a mark team can actually just gank someone on turn 1 or turn 2 and secure some really easy kills, which is why it matches up pretty well against stress teams, because you can't really do much against it if they have the snipers that have, the guard piercing. But that's why I think it's kind of funny when people talk about how frustrating stress is to play against when, right now mark teams can pretty much, if they get the turns in the right order, if they go first or something like that, they can just gank you by turn 2, and then you're just on the back foot the whole time. But I guess people consider that honest gameplay because, you know, you pick a plan, you go, okay, I get this person, I mark that person, I shoot that person. Oh, you guard that person? Too bad, I shoot that person again. Yeah, it's not like Stress has this just opening burst potential to kill someone. Or you just get ganked by a Jester early on because, you know, you get crit on something and then Jester's in rank 2 and they just like finales next turn for, you know, 14 damage and you're just dead. So I don't know, for as frustrating as Stress is to play against, I mean, at least it's not as lethal in the opening turns as some other strategies because the concept of Death Spiral still very much applies to PvP Darkest Dungeon as it applies to the base game. So once you lose someone, you need to be in some kind of at least okay position to still win the game because it's like, if you lose someone and you're not fully healthy on the rest of your team, or if you lose someone and you're not going to kill someone on their team next turn, then usually the game is pretty much going to spiral out of control very quickly unless some stuff goes your way. Or unless the other person just throws it, which is possible. I guess my point is that that's just the silver lining, where Stress at least takes a little bit of time to build up before it starts wrecking you, but, you know, if the RNG goes against you, it still wrecks you pretty fast and just doesn't feel fun. The next point actually lies in the fact that Bellow is the issue. I think we're all pretty familiar with it at this point. Some of the Stress moves are a little bit overtuned, like Zealous Accusations is pretty efficient for what it does. You know, it's got minus 30% damage penalty, does really good stress, and then Crusader can just throw out the list at you and hit you for 9 damage on 2 characters, which is very relevant. And because it does that, sometimes you can get those good instances where the person's under, you know, 10 hit points, but they're at like 180 stress. So you hit Zealous Accusations, they take the damage, they hit 0 hit points, then they heart attack. So some of the Stress moves are a little too efficient. I don't think people are complaining about Blinding Gas. I'm not seeing too many people complaining about how oppressive Blinding Gas is in their games. They're like, she just, Plague Doctor just blinds us, and then my accuracy's down, and then I can't hit her, and then she just does it again, I can't move her, and then she just sits there and just Blinding Gas over and over, and my team loses, I'm mad. That doesn't happen. So anytime people really talk about Stress, it's Bellow. Bellow is the big offender. Man-at-Arms is just a good character in this mode. His whole kit matches up very well with team synergy. He's got bolster for dodge comps and helping you not get stressed out. He has guard, which can be clutch, especially if they don't have guard piercing. Then he has riposte, which is going to be relevant, I think, as time goes on because things like cleave teams are becoming more relevant, and as other things get adjusted, like as Stress goes by the wayside, you know, what else is going to come up? Be more direct damage, so having riposte is going to be important. And then he has the riposte trinket, which is going to make riposte even better. Or riposte, I'm not sure how it's pronounced. I looked at an English dictionary website that had verbal pronunciations, and it said I think the UK version is riposte, and then the American version is riposte, so I'm sorry. Yeah, everything with the Stress archetype just ties back to Bellow, which is why, I don't know if I coined this term, I hope I did. I just came up with it off the top of my head, but I call Man-at-Arms the Bellow bot because that's just what it is. And the reason it came to be is I remember in one of my videos for my match analysis that I put up, there was someone in the comments, because I played a Stress team, and they said that, you know, you would have lost that game if Man-at-Arms used Bellow on turn 1. I think the Man-at-Arms decided to bolster turn 1, and at that point I was thinking, Bellow is so just out of control that Man-at-Arms can forego his best battle-long buff instead to deal the extra stress and the damage, or the minus damage, the debuff, right? So at that point, that's when I was like, okay, these are just Bellow bots, because they just know I hit that button and that button only. It doesn't matter what the rest of the buttons are on my hotbar, I can just take the other 3 off. And I'm actually thinking of now maybe I can make a video where I style on people where I take off all the abilities on Man-at-Arms except Bellow. We'll see what happens there, who knows. Yeah, it all comes back to Bellow. It's too efficient at what it does. It's got really good accuracy. He can use it anywhere. It hits everyone. It can't be riposted. And then it lowers your damage. So if Man-at-Arms is going first, the dodge buff you get for going second doesn't matter too much to him, especially if he has the insignia of rank. He's got a pretty solid, like maybe 80% chance to Bellow everyone at that point. And then also he has the debuff bonus from that same trinket. So Bellow's usually going to hit like 3 or 4 people and then stick on pretty much everyone it hits. And so you're taking all this stress damage, but at the same time, Man-at-Arms is also lowering your direct damage. So if you have a team that isn't stress or a team that doesn't rely on Mark Synergy, can usually overpower it because it's just got a lot of bonus damage, but if you have a direct damage team and you don't use damage over time, or you're not a stress team, then Bellow is just going to really hinder your damage, which means that the stress game plan just gets more and more traction. So each turn, Man-at-Arms is hitting you with Bellow, your damage is going down, you're doing less damage, you can't kill that team fast enough, and then they're guaranteed to start getting their heart attacks. Which means that Bellow is the core issue. Because, I made the joke about blinding gas and stuff, but, if you lower, like, Zealous Accusations just a little bit, maybe like 15 stress or something, and then, like, Bellow just needs a straight nerf. It can either do less stress or less damage penalty. I think it needs both. Once Bellow goes by the wayside, I think stress is going to be a little more difficult to pull off. But we'll see, that's just my assumption. So yeah, I think if we're going to talk about how busted stress teams are, we do have to try and think about it if Man-at-Arms was at least weaker or just didn't exist. Because I think he is the key factor to all of it. You can just slap Man-at-Arms in every team at this point. You can put him on, well, you do put him on every stress team, and it doesn't matter really what the other three characters are on the stress team. As long as you have Man-at-Arms, it's very consistent. Since Bellow hits all 4 people and does the damage penalty, you can tailor your team to stress out either the front line or the back line, which means he synergizes with all those. So if you have like blinding gas, Bellow's helping that. If you have accusations or yop, Bellow's helping that. If you're using weakening curse, Bellow's helping that quite a bit actually. There's a lot of synergy there. So that means that for, I guess the 4th time I keep saying it, right? But it means that Bellow is the key offender. So I think if Bellow got tweaked, I think stress would be less common and probably less frustrating. The last analytical point is kind of a bigger issue with Butcher Circus as a whole. For as fun as it is, if you can ignore the connection issues, it is very difficult to have a competitive PvP experience with a game that has this much variance. I respect Red Hook deeply for going for it. I think it's fun. I do think that they at least gave it its due diligence with the soundtracks and the custom corpses and the art. Like the Butcher looks cool, the Circus arena looks fun. It's got this kind of weird Rakdos vibe. I've heard people talk about that if you know your Magic the Gathering, and I think that's pretty fitting, so I like that a lot. The last point I'll make here is that it will be difficult, for as fun as Butcher Circus can be, to make a competitive PvP experience when the game has this much variance. As we talked about at the start of the video, variance is very common in Darkest Dungeon. It's one of the core ideas alongside the stress mechanic. So having coin flips or 10%ers, or you crunch the numbers and it comes out to like 0.2%, losing those is just not fulfilling as a competitive experience. And I'm not trying to take away things from the players. I'm not trying to say that every loss is based on RNG, because there are a lot of players that get to Darkest 1, they're just very good. They understand the tempo of the game, they understand the comps, they understand when to take risks, they understand how to exploit the smallest mistakes in their opponents. And that's what you need to do. I say that's how you do, but that's what you need to do in order to be good at any competitive game, or any competitive thing for that matter. So I'm not trying to take anything away from those people, but what I am saying is that because there's so much variance in Darkest Dungeon, I think Circus will never be as great as it can be or as competitive as people want. Because at the end of the day, you just have to understand that sometimes the opponent's going to nail 2 15% chances back to back, or like you're going to get through their death blow in the 1 in 4 or something. I think I've death blowed a couple people at 85%, for instance. And these things happen. It's just what happens in the game. I think once we recognize that, maybe the Circus is a little less stressful, for lack of a better word. So I said I was going to propose some solutions. I think we've already gone over them a little bit. So the stress heals and reduction trinkets for stress and virtue chances are all pretty weak by comparison. So if they were buffed a little bit, or stress itself was weakened just a tiny bit, so it wasn't as efficient of a tactic, then that would probably help a bit. The next point is that Bellow, as I said before, is just too strong. So I think they need to tweak that a little bit, because otherwise, I don't know, maybe there's some videos out there where people don't run Man-at-Arms in a stress team. I'm curious how they do. It feels like it's a little clunky because, what do you do at that point? You have maybe Hellion, Crusader, and then like Occultist Grave Robber or something like that, or Plague Doctor. And it just doesn't feel like on paper it would mesh. But maybe there's a video out there. I don't know. You gotta do some more research in that regard. To recap, I think stress needs to be in the game. I think it needs to be good, or at least viable to some degree. Even if it's like a 10% encounter rate in terms of the meta, I think it does need to be viable just because stress is what the game is built on. And there's a lot of people, like myself included, that when we heard about Butcher Circus, we were thinking, how do we stress the opponent? Because that's going to be pretty cool, because we were looking at the screenshots. They had the stress bars that were filling up. So I was like, how are we going to be able to do this? And Red Hook actually, for the most part, outside of Bellow, did make it happen. So that's pretty cool, because we were always wondering how stress would work if we got to do it to people, because we don't get to do it to the monsters. So I hope stress does stick around in some form. For the pros, we talk about stuff like stress is too easy to use, it's very effective, it's low variance, you don't have to worry about what the enemy team is, and then when we talked about the negatives, it's not fun to play against, and the normal ways in terms of items to combat it just aren't that good. Instead, we've come up with things like high damage teams that just punch through it before it can really get off the ground. It's not too often I tell people to like the videos and all that, but if you enjoyed this discussion, definitely let me know about it. Hit the like-a-roni or leave a comment or something. And, you know, you're fine to disagree. I like to have really good discussions in these things. And a lot of my other videos, that's what we've had, so I've been very thankful. Have some very cool viewers so far. And I think there are other topics we might be able to cover as they get more egregious in the future. So if something becomes as, I don't know, like unfun or strong as stress is right now, then we can talk about it. Or if like a certain character becomes busted that people didn't know about. One of the other ideas I have right now is the bounty hunter, because, you know, he's just basically guaranteed execution. So there's just a lot of stuff to talk about with this game. So introducing Butcher Circus gave us a lot of new stuff. It's been fun to digest and tackle and talk about. So I'd like to keep doing it. As I said though, that's gonna be the video, so like, comment, subscribe, all that nonsense. Join Discord. Thank you, Motorcycle, that just drove by my open window as I'm wrapping up this video. But yeah, that just kind of afflicted me IRL. I'm not sure what's happening right now. Oh yeah, we're wrapping this up, so like I said, all the cool stuff, join Discord, come talk to us. We have like almost 200 people, which is awesome. And thanks for watching, and I'll see you later.